Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
So what does the fifth year of an economic recovery look like exactly, and why do we still call it a recovery? Especially since this part of our business cycle is now a longer expansion than the average expansion. Welcome again to the most widely watched dialogue on Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time, from high-tech to old-school building materials, we will wade into the business and policy issues that count and mean something. Later joining us, Martin Marietta boss, Ward Nye.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 16, 2015. On this week's program, Bill Mahoney, CEO of SCRA Applied Technologies, Clifton Vann IV, CEO of Hyde Park Partners, and special guest Ward Nye, CEO of Martin Marietta. And now, here's Chris Williams.
Hello, welcome to our program. Clifton, good to have you here. And Bill,
Thanks
welcome back.
Thanks, Chris.
Guys, we're going to start with politics. That's always fun. South Carolina State House, North Carolina General Assembly, now back to work, back in session. 2015's off to a roaring start. Bill, you look at Governor Haley's budget, and she talks about a lot of things. Public safety is pretty important. Fixing DSS was pretty important. Education, but there's really no talk in there about transportation, which has been staked out by not just business, but municipalities and a lot of folks as being the number one issue, really close to education in the state. So if the governor and even Speaker Jay Lucas, new Speaker Jay Lucas, said that transportation is probably not going to get anything done in fiscal year 2015, is that a misstep?
You know, I don't think so. I think that the mandate from the state Supreme Court about the education system is really going to be the top priority. I mean, I'm saying this as an observant citizen, so I don't know anything really about how the plan goes. I can tell you that from working with the industry base in South Carolina and with the Department of Commerce, there is a lot of interest in transportation, distribution, logistics, from the road surfaces on up to the networks that are being put together there. So I think what you'll see is if I have to handicap, is the Assembly will focus on education, but the industrial base will continue to push towards transportation, a la the public-private partnership led by the State Ports Authority that set forward the upstate inland port, which is really to help BMW, but also their supply base ship goods to the Port of Charleston. So those types of issues, I think you're going to see led by the business community through public-private partnerships, and I think the legislature is going to have their hands full with education. And
this is just speculation, but when you've got businesses like Boeing that clearly have been successful, and the gift that keeps on giving, like BMW in the upstate, when arguably South Carolina wins some of these big economic development deals, and they haven't, or the state hasn't done anything about education, I guess what's the incentive if these deals keep coming to the state?
Right. Well, I think, ultimately, anchor corporations are one part of the equation, but the neck of the woods that SCRA works in is really the technology companies and the feeders and the tier suppliers in the supply chain that come in to support these. Filling in around the anchor companies is equally as important as developing and landing the anchor company. So there are two parts to the economic development story around manufacturing and the manufacturing and technology base, and you really need to be able to fill in around the anchor company with really dynamic, capable technology providers, whether they're startups or established companies that have been in the tier supply role for the anchor firms, and education is a really important part. When companies evaluate placing a new location around a Boeing, a lot of the employees there want to know where their kid's going to go to school.
Yeah, which thank you for the segue to Clifton, because Clifton, you fall into a bunch of categories: high tech, supplier, education. When you hear Bill's comments on questions around the General Assembly or the State House is going to do the right thing, how do you feel?
Well, in terms of education, I mean, we're always hopeful that the right things are going to be done, but I think at this point in the business community, we're not going to lean solely on hope as our strategy. We are now engaging the educational system directly ourselves. So in my case, I've partnered with a number of very large advanced manufacturing companies in Southwest Charlotte. We have an engagement at the Olympic community of schools where we are not there for altruism. We are there to build a pipeline for ourselves, the human resources that we need, the talent that we're going to need. So we're investing considerable amounts of dollars. In fact, I think $8 million has been invested by this group in cash and in kind to Olympic to ensure that the kinds of people that are coming out of that school are going to meet the needs of the future workforce.
Okay,
for our companies.
but let me ask you this, and not to interrupt you, but how much can business really do if policy is not friendly to what business needs? In other words, if the General Assembly has other priorities besides just helping K through 12 and doesn't do what you need to get, as you say, your supply chain and human capital and education done in schools, how much can you really do if political players in Raleigh don't go along?
Well, there's certainly some limitations. At the same time, we've been working in Raleigh to make sure our leadership understands that this is a key driver for economic development and attracting new businesses. The governor's been lobbying for more tools to attract business today, and I think at the end of the day, when we talk to our manufacturing customers, education is really the draw, not only for my children, but for my employees. Where am I going to find the kinds of people that are going to do the high-tech jobs that we're going to need?
You think there is more, and this is a question for both of you, when it comes to education, we kind of left, the train is left about transportation, but when it comes to education, do you feel like the governor is saying more than, is giving it more than just lip service about education?
Well, I think there are some things being done. I personally am actually on the governor's Education and Workforce Innovation Committee, and we've spent $9 million here recently on a 5-year plan to invest in STEM education for North Carolina schools. So there are some things beginning to happen, but I realize that the governments are strapped, and so there's the issue of where does the money come from to do the things we need to do, and even if we had the money, do we actually know what needs to be done? The rate of change in business today is such that in a 4-year degree, by the time you're finished, there's jobs that existed that didn't exist when you started, and there's jobs that don't exist that did exist when you started. So how do you keep up with all that? And I think the private sector has to have at least a handshake relationship with the educational system.
Yeah, Bill, you've got a stake in that game.
We do.
In the STEM education.
Yeah, our Technology Ventures division has invested in a company called STEM Premier, which is based in Charleston. But it is essentially, if you can call it, LinkedIn for STEM stars. And it's partnering now with the ACT. It's working with a program called Project Lead the Way, which is the broadest STEM curriculum set operational around the country. And what they're doing is they're creating a value chain, if you will, of STEM capable people so that schools, colleges and universities, technical colleges, and employers can ultimately look back through that value chain and identify, just like colleges and professional teams identify sports stars, you can identify STEM stars through STEM Premier. So that deployment in South Carolina and also the fact that anchor corporations are in fact adopting middle schools, high schools, et cetera, in the state, I think mirrors Vann saying about the corporations starting to get engaged now because they need the workers. One of the worst things we could do in South Carolina would be to either form or recruit a very large company and then not be able to provide them with the employees. That would be a cliff type of event. So, it really is important for us, I think, and I think as I handicap the legislature will have this priority, but there's also corporations and technologies and other actors in the education value chain that are coming to bear now to address the situation.
How far can the private sector, can businesses, same question as Clifton just said, how far can you get down the road if you don't have not political cover, but policy cover? In other words, if the State House doesn't make it more friendly to expand the skilled workforce vis-a-vis policy, public policy, how much can you do if you don't have that cover?
Well, I think South Carolina does a very good job with programs like Workforce SC, the SC Ready program through the technical colleges. I think if you stack up what we're doing there, and I say we collectively, not that we're involved in the workforce development game at SCRA, but what we're doing is we're investing in the entrepreneurs and the startups that are emerging from those types of programs, and in providing technologies through our R&D centers to the tier suppliers that are supporting those anchor companies. So I think there's a lot we can do. I think that you have to have an environment, though, and this is set by, I believe, our political leaders, where education is valued and the business, academic, government, and economic development communities are encouraged to support it in the ways that they can.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there and bring our guest on and keep the dialogue going. Gentlemen, thank you. Stay with us. Next week on this program, his name is Michael McGuire. Mike is the fairly newly minted Chief Executive Officer of the 4th largest accounting firm in the United States and one of the largest on the globe, Grant Thornton. Mike McGuire will be here next week, and then in 2 weeks, philanthropy. Where is philanthropy in the Carolinas? Where are the challenges, and how has it changed along with this new paradigm in the economy? We'll find out with a panel on philanthropy. Our guest leads one of these long-established, venerated companies that seems to have has grown fairly predictably with each passing decade, and in fact, almost 8 decades now. Raleigh-based S&P-listed Martin Marietta Materials is seemingly more than just digging rocks out of the ground, but has leveraged its product into a leading supplier of aggregates and heavy building materials in more than 30 states. Joining us now, Martin Marietta Materials Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer, Ward Nye. Mr. Chairman, welcome. Good to have you here.
It's good to be back, Chris.
We're going to take it easy on you. We're getting to the policy questions, Ward, believe me,
okay,
about education and transportation. But, you know, when you, Ward, you're down in the weeds. You're doing a hand-to-hand combat in an economy. You see it pretty dramatically, I would guess, in your top line, in your growth. So here we are, the 5th year in a recovery, and we're still calling it a recovery. What do you see? What are you looking out for 2015?
You know what, as I'm looking at where we're going, really 15 and 16, Mark Ventnor, one of your colleagues, said a few weeks ago, he sees this year and next year as really probably 2 of the better years that we've seen, to your point, in the last decade. And we've seen a recovery in housing. We've seen a recovery in non-residential. Infrastructure, candidly, still lags, but here's what I think we're seeing. Housing over the last 12 months, ending in November, is up about 50% from where it was in the Carolinas at the absolute bottom of the cycle. It's still 50% off of where it was at the last cycle as well. So to your point, this has been a long, very slow recovery. Non-res, if you think about this, 14% up in the trailing 12 months in South Carolina. 10% up in North Carolina, but what it tends to do is it follows housing with a little bit of a lag. So it doesn't so much surprise us. So we are seeing a comeback, but in fairness, in the southeastern U.S., it's been a very slow but steady comeback. In the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, employment growth, 2.6%. Now that feels better than the U.S. average at 2%, but at the same time, for much of this recovery, we've been lagging the U.S. average.
So how do you plan? Let's go to you just talked about residential housing. So if housing was a bubble before, and we've got comparative, and you say we're about halfway back, how much more room growth before it doesn't, it's not a bubble, but is fully valued, if you will, the best way I know how to ask.
Sure. What I look at, you said we're in the reeds, we're actually in the dirt, if you think about it. So actually what we do, we'll go back and take a look at where we were selling our product. So at the absolute peak of our markets back in 2006 and 7, 21% of our product went to housing. Now, what I'll tell you is sitting at Martin Marietta, 21% of our product shouldn't go to housing. At the bottom of the market, 7% of it went to housing. 7% shouldn't be going to housing either. Around 15% should. So if we look at a normalized run rate over not just a decade, but decades of time, when we start seeing numbers in those percentages, I think as an overall economy and as a company, we'll feel considerably better. So do we see it heading towards a bubble? No, not at all. Do we see plenty of growth? We do. North Carolina is forecasted to bring 3 million people into this state between now and 2030. So housing them, giving them places to shop, having places to send them to school, and being able to get them from point A to point B is going to be critically important to both of our states.
Bill?
You know, taking a look at the economic marketplace that you're operating in, geographically across the country, where are your strongest markets and what do you expect to see out of them over the course of the next couple of years?
Our strongest markets the last few years have been west of the Mississippi and much slower east of the Mississippi. A lot of that's been driven by population dynamics. We have a significant presence in Texas. It's our largest state by revenue today. We entered a very nice market several years ago in Denver. And up and down the Front Range has been a nice marketplace to be in. You don't have any county in that part of the world, oddly enough, that, for example, has as many people in it as Wake County does at over 1 million, but still you're seeing a nice migration there. One of the steadiest markets in which we've operated, Iowa. I mean, when you hear Iowa, you don't think, my gosh, the economy there must be very, very healthy. It's very steady. The agriculture community has worked through this process very effectively in the downturn. They've used technology, they've lowered their cost. At the same time, if I told you Google and Facebook and others have been building significant data warehouses in that state, that has really helped underscore much of that. If we look at commercial activity in the United States, really for the half year, it was up about $30 billion across the country, but $15 billion of that was in Houston, Texas all by itself. So there's your east-west dichotomy. If we come to this part of the country that's our home, that we care about, that's important to all of us, places like Atlanta, we saw plus minus a 70% volume drop from peak to trough in Atlanta. Atlanta went from building around 55,000 housing starts a year to building closer to 5.
Wow.
And obviously we saw an economy here in Charlotte with the banking world in particular that had to be revisited. Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill has fared reasonably well because you've got state government. You've got UNC, you have Duke, you've got a college community and a Research Triangle Park that's kept it relatively stable. But places like the Triad have really struggled. Those are furniture, they're textile, they're other manufacturing economies. And we're seeing that getting better, but back to your point too, Chris, it's been a very slow rise from where that was. But it does give you the dichotomy, Bill, of an east-west divide.
Right, interesting.
Clifton?
Yeah, Ward, I was curious, most of the conversations you hear in the news are about the revenue side of transportation, road construction, these kinds of things. I was curious from the cost side, what do you see in terms of innovation and new technologies that are going to come out or emerge that might make this task less costly or improve the maintenance of our roads and these kinds of things? Is there a new technology coming that's going to have an offset on the cost side?
Yeah, I think over time, if we look at what we do in that process, we're creating aggregates that will find its way into road base, into concrete, into asphalt, and other parts of the process. What we've seen over time is a change in the need and the requirement that the Department of Transportation and CDOT, SCDOT, and others will want, because they're wanting super paved technology. They don't want crushed stone necessarily that's round. They want crushed stone that looks more cubical because it actually fits together more neatly. The bitumen that's holding the stone together can last longer. You have roads that can endure. At the same time, you come back to your point and look at cost just in our business. We're still selling our product on average for, call it $11 a ton. There are not a lot of things in your life that you want that you can buy for $11 a ton except our product. So we have to be awfully good on the cost side of it. Technology has helped us there. We care deeply about our employees. As we've come through this downturn, 25% of our cost of goods sold are people. And there are times you have to make incredibly difficult decisions, and our industry had to do that. And at peak employment in Heritage Mart Marietta, we had around 7,200 employees. At the absolute bottom, around 5,000. And that's a wrenching process, to your point, to go through. It makes you cautious when an economy comes back. It makes you cautious on how you hire. It makes you look carefully at technology and how you can do things better. But at the end of the day, it's still a very labor-intensive process that we're involved in, as well as road contractors.
Let's go from your practice to the policy of the industry that you serve, and specifically transportation and infrastructure. I mean, clearly that's important to Martin Marietta stakeholders, and I know you're engaged in this ward. So, what are some of the hard decisions, to use your term? What are the hard decisions that North Carolina and South Carolina will have to make when it comes to policy around getting transportation right? It's clearly code. The term transportation is code for economic development, but it's also a hard asset. What do we need to do? How do we need to finance it? And what's the dialogue that needs to be happening?
Well, I think a couple of things. Number one, I think what the governor and Secretary Tate have done in North Carolina is helpful. I think they've raised the profile of it. I think the North Carolina Chamber has helped raise the profile of that as well. So I think coming out with a 20-year vision, which was critically needed, is important, number one. I think using demographics and true data to determine where you're going to build the roads and where the people are is important, and we're seeing that. I think the governor's plan to put $1.5 billion worth of bonds on rural roads is critically important, because those are the parts of our state that in this very slow recovery have really not enjoyed the recovery. Here's where I think the point though is, Chris. If we look at this recovery in North Carolina, there are at least 13 counties that have seen no employment recovery whatsoever as we've gone through it. And what I'm focused on when I speak to that is really the I-95 corridor, because you're looking as far north as Northampton County, as far south as Robeson County. Now, not all of the counties that have seen no recovery are in that corridor. The vast majority of them are. But here's the issue. You've got a road that was built somewhere between the mid-1950s and the early 1980s, and it still looks very much the same as it did at that point in time. Now, North Carolina's undertaken a study to look at Interstate 95, and the quick math tells us to come back, address it, raise it, resurface it, and make it wider, 6 to 8 lanes. It takes $4 billion. If you look at our budget, the numbers that could be there are $400 million. So you've got a tenfold issue to try to address it. Now, to your point, Chris, from a policy perspective, what do we need to do? Trying to fill a hole that's that significant is a challenge. And what I think we're going to have to continue to do is look at different ways of financing. Now, that's a very clever way of saying we're going to have to talk about more toll roads, not just in North Carolina, but Southeast and the rest of the United States. Because from where I'm sitting right now, it's one of the few ways that we can really do that. Public-private partnerships, and we're seeing the evidence of that first real step into it on I-77 and hot lanes here in Charlotte, can make a profound difference. And there are ways that I believe in a real policy debate that we can talk about using tolls. At the same time, the other side of that debate, in fairness, will be this is the poorest part of the state. Right. And going and hitting people in the poorest part of the state with paying tolls doesn't feel entirely fair. I think there's also a policy mechanism that can help give the people in that part of the world relief. But we are going to have to talk about funding, and we are going to have to recognize that a gas tax that doesn't have a serious index at all on the federal side, and CAFE standards that are coming in between now and 2025 will basically take miles per gallon from, call it 25, 26 miles per gallon to 50, 53, 54 miles a gallon, tells us that the way that we do this today doesn't work as we go forward.
With us, and we're out of time, was this going to be a hard reality that both South and North Carolina are going to have to face?
It will be, no question about it.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about the corridor of shame along I-95, because I know it's a very real thing. Ward, thanks for being on the program. Nice to see you.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
good to see you. Thanks, Chris.
Clifton, welcome.
Thank you.
Come back.
Thank you for having me.
Bill, come back. Always nice to see you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.